The Lost Cause. After the Civil War was over, things were far from perfect. You have cities in the South in ruins, farmsteads basically stripped of everything except for the soil. Infrastructure, such as like railroads, were extremely damaged. Factories and machinery had been demolished. For the South and for white Southerners, the cause had been lost. Society was destroyed as they knew it. And so in the summer and fall of like 1865, white people in the South were surrounded by, the ghosts of their loved ones who never returned and just hard times. And trying to understand this, some asked, was this divine judgment, or is this meaning that God just had something bigger planned for the South? And thus we see the birth of the ideology known as the Lost Cause. The Lost Cause ideology is one that persists, unfortunately, still to this day. This is the idea that, the cause of the so-called Confederacy was just and heroic. And that, the South, when they rebelled, they were really just struggling to save their way of life. And of course, that way of life is always about like states' rights. And they were trying to just protect themselves from Northern aggression. The thing is, the ideology of the Lost Cause minimizes or just outright erases the role that slavery played in this conflict. It basically sees the South on the best possible terms when it comes to this violent war. The Lost Cause ideology justifies the Southern perspective rather than admitting that the South was flawed in their ideology. It romanticizes what is the old South, or the South before the Civil War, and thus makes it understandable why the South rebelled. But like I said before, this erases the role that slavery played in this conflict, and the fact that many Southerners understood that slavery was wrong, and yet they still persisted to ensure slavery because that was the institution they knew. That was the institution they wanted to keep, and because they had such extreme racist views against African Americans. The thing about this ideology, though, is it did enable white Southerners to move on with their lives and concentrate on rebuilding their shattered region. However, rather than the North being their enemy, now white Southerners viewed African Americans as their adversities, who any attempt at self-improvement is a direct challenge to their white supremacy. And to assist black Southerners would be to invade the South all over again. Of course, African Americans are going to view the Civil War in much different terms, a very different perspective. For them, it was a great victory of freedom and great possibility. The thing is, many African Americans in 1865 don't initially dream of social equality. Really, they wanted two things. They wanted, firstly, to be left alone by white people. But the problem was, the other thing they wanted was land, voting and civil rights, and education. And these things, really, they would need the support of the white power structure. In 1865, many African Americans didn't, it was a dared to hope for something beyond emancipation. But we are going to see steps beyond emancipation, such as the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865. This was a multi-purpose agency that was supposed to provide social, educational, economic services, advice, and protection all to former slaves, but not just them, but also white, destitute Southerners. One thing that the Freedmen's Bureau did very successfully is help provide an education to many African Americans. They would establish 3,000 freedmen's schools. Really quick, freedmen is a term used interchangeably with former slave. So freed men, all one word. So 3,000 freedmen's schools are established, and this would serve about 150,000 men, women, and children. So we're going to see literacy rates amongst the black population in the South increase. And we're going to see 13 colleges established by the American Missionary Association. You see the establishment of black and white churches. Of course, right away, you also get a backlash against this. Many white Southerners condemned any effort they saw as being, and I put in quotes, Negro improvement. Many white people saw any time spent on education on African Americans as wasted. They would harass white female teachers and question their morals if they taught black students. Eventually, the Freedmen's Bureau is actually going to fold in 1872. This was because Northern societies that had supported freedmen's education either collapsed or just cut back their involvement in this institution. And after that point, education for black Southerners became a lot more haphazard. And this is going to be a theme we're going to see in this entire period after the Civil War, known as Reconstruction. Then there was the issue of land. A lot of freedmen wanted to own their own farms because they saw this as being the true transition from being a slave to being free. And many of them had worked in agriculture previously as enslaved population. The idea of 40 acres and a mule, technically this comes from Sherman's Field Order number 15. This was during Sherman's march to the sea and everything, setting aside land, basically for specifically African Americans, former slaves, of grants up to 40 acres. And we do see former slaves settling on land in the South because of this. We also get in 1866 the Southern Homestead Act giving black people preferential access to public lands in 5 Southern states. However, even with these kinds of orders, the majority of former slaves, especially those in the Lower South, never own land. Even Sherman's Field Order number 15 was viewed really as a temporary measure that only really occurred during the Civil War itself. And it's actually going to be nullified by President Andrew Johnson, who takes over for Lincoln when he's assassinated in September of 1865. Most land redistributing programs after the Civil War actually wanted black people to have capital, which is extremely difficult if you had been a slave. So even when you look at the Republicans of the North, they're not necessarily pushing for former slaves to own land in their own right. A lot of their rhetoric, extolled free labor over slave labor. And so they basically wanted slaves to, enjoy the fruits of their labor and hope to become owners or entrepreneurs themselves eventually. So they wanted black people to take the status of free laborers, not independent landowners. Even in the North, reviving the Southern economy was seen as more important than helping former slaves acquire farms, and thus freedom, and thus capital, and thus so much more. So basically, the United States encouraged freedmen to, go back to work for their former masters, but under contract, and, postpone that quest for land. And so, in fact, by the 1870s, most former slaves are in a new subservient position under the new labor system of sharecropping. Sharecropping basically was a system where sharecroppers were given a house, a plot of land to work, seed, maybe some farm animals, farm implements. They might even be given some credit at a store. Of course, the landlord would typically own. And they were supposed to work the land, and in exchange, the sharecroppers were supposed to give the landlord a share of their crop, thus sharecroppers. Usually this was about 1/2, and the idea is that then the other half would go to, in theory, they could save up to maybe secure their own economic independence and buy their own land outright eventually. That's in theory, because in practice, most of these freedmen, their proceeds from their share never left them very far ahead, and so many sharecroppers actually found themselves in perpetual debt and basically working as virtual slaves. We're also going to see cities. Many freedmen are going to move to cities after the war is over. Before the war, keep in mind, cities had offered a lot of slaves and free black people a measure of freedom. After the war is over, many are going to move to cities to find their families, seek out work, just escape the tedium or supervision of farm life, or even simply just test, do they really have the right to move about? And so we're going to see between 1860 and 1870, the black population of every southern city is going to rise significantly. We also have to mention faith. The church really was a primary focus for African American life, especially so after the Civil War. Many African Americans saw emancipation in biblical terms. They also realized that the church was their opportunity to hone skills of like self-government and administration that, quite frankly, white society denied them a position in. It also was a place that they could gain an education so that they might be able to, read the Bible. You also get a lot of other organizations coming from the church, from, burial society, Masonic lodges, to temperance groups, trade unions, drama clubs. But looking at all of this, it's very clear African Americans could not secure the true fruits of their emancipation without the support and protection of the federal government.